Hey, what's up, guys? You know me, I like covering the hard luck Italians. They also are my ancestors. But I covered the medium tanks. I figured I would cover their light tanks, the armored cars, kind of like what I did with the Americans. But instead of doing two videos, I'm probably just gonna do one. And here you go. Here's the CV-33s, the Carovallaccis, the tankettes. Okay, this is what made up the majority of the Italian armored units at the beginning of the Second World War. Yes, yes. You can tell that we are gonna have problems right off the bat. So, and, ironically, in terms of tank development, the first Italian tank ever was this thing. Look at this cool thing, man. Something out of like a science fiction. The Fiat 2000. But of course, in terms of the war experience, the Alps and the mountainous regions was where Italy thought it would have ground combat with, obviously, fighting in the lower parts of Italy. On the side, it's going to be mostly naval battles. So the Renault, right, the French Renault and their copies of it seem to be fit the bill. And when you see what's coming next, you can argue that they probably should have stuck with these. Okay, I mean, you were still finding these things, sure. In Afghanistan, the home of the heroes, you still were finding these things into the 2000s. But of course, we ended up with this thing. Okay. I mean, listen, I would if I could get one for a decent price, I wouldn't mind having this in my in my backyard or whatever. But it would be useful. But probably the flamethrower variant would be useful for today. But you can see where you're gonna have problems with this thing when you're fighting other tanks. Okay. So now they were pretty quick on the road, but they were very unreliable as well. They would break down around like fix it again, Tony, that old joke. They had flamethrower variants. They were somewhat successful against the Ethiopians, but they had some problems when they got ambushed. Okay, and also a bunch of them broke down. Spanish Civil War was a little different. Right? Oh my God! If you gave me one of these for free, I wouldn't take this. But essentially, like I said, once you start fighting, these things, like I said, even in the Spanish Civil War, you didn't have a ton of tank-to-tank combat. So there was actually a trick they did where they would have these things, anti-tank guns, be a target, go back, and then draw the Russian tanks in to get shot by the anti-tank gun. Still. There's another tank there, but I'm going to continue going over with this one here. And you see this. Now, they started, obviously, this is the flamethrower variant. Okay, this would be kind of cool to have today. You could put stuff in the back, right? Of course, this is one of the early anti-tank 20mm guns they put on this thing. Okay, the Italians right away knew they were in trouble going against the British. Their armored cars were deadlier than these things. Okay, not to mention their tanks. Okay, I'm just going to continue going over the CV3. I'm going to go back for those other tanks that you may have witnessed. But, right, they didn't really draw too many lessons from the Ethiopians or the Spanish Civil War, although they were next to useless against the T-26, the Russian tank. Okay, even the Poles had like a tankette like this, but it had an anti-tank gun. I mean, it's cool. I mean, if you're not having a war, right, it's kind of cool, right? That's a cool picture, actually. Good photo. Right? I like that. Obviously, 2-man, right? But then we get into combat. We have problems with the problems. Obviously, not just not having communications. There were a lot of Italians. They outnumbered the British, not greatly, but they were distributed not well in defensive positions, and they were useless against even the light tanks and armored cars, the cruisers. Forget the Matilda, right? So there was these poor guys were trying to modify the tank to have some kind of cannon ability, like the anti-tank rifle, and even those mortars. Of course, the Brixia mortar I showed you in that other book. 1 pound grenades. It's not really gonna help you too much. Of course, the Italians get run over. Right. These early defeats are what really cement in the mind of the Italian cowardice, incompetence, whatever. It wasn't just that they had lousy tank. Obviously, I keep saying, okay, the Italians were not ready for the war, and they took a chance. Okay, someone said, "Oh, the British weren't ready for the war either." Really, you have an empire. Okay, it's not the Italians' fault. You lost all your tanks in France, so, but you still had plenty more. Okay? Luckily, the Americans were gonna lend you some. Okay, but regardless, you see them. The thing is that these things lasted for a while. They were still using these things even when they had the M11s, the M14s. They were still using these things, and the majority of them that weren't destroyed, they eventually just broke down. So there were some successes they had, okay, ambushing columns and whatnot, but not the better moment. Now, going back, I wanted to show you they developed an actual light tank at some point, which is kind of a cool tank to look. It looks more like a tank. It has a turret, all right. Has a cannon. It has a 20mm cannon. Okay. Oh boy, now this I wouldn't mind having this, even though it's small. It's a 2-man tank. It's wow. It almost looks like they just put a turret on top of the ones I just showed you. Ironically, these became used as reconnaissance with the Bersaglieri on the Eastern Front. The Italian military in Russia, all they had were these light tanks and the Semoventi, right? The anti-tank version of this, the same chassis, right? You can see the same tracks, but with a 47mm cannon with more firepower. Unfortunately, by the time these were being made, it was already out of date again. Okay, you see how a lot of stuff. I can really understand some of the more complex war games where you have that wheel, right? And you put resources in during your turns, and then you can start getting the weapons and stuff long after, because it takes a while to build them. And then when you're falling behind, you don't catch up real quick, especially if you're Italy. So you just don't have the industrial capacity. So, but still, I like the paintings. I still think it's a cool tank. So, like I said, I wouldn't mind having it in my backyard or driveway. So, yeah, the heroes. That's right. Oh. So, just like I said, also the photos. Yeah. I mean, these guys still had guts. They would go. I mean, the Italians always went forward, but like them and the Russians. And actually, here's CV. What is this? 35, the L335 in Russia. Okay? It's like early 42. So, right, look how small the tank is. So, obviously, the ones they had, like I said, by the Don River battles, these things were destroyed and captured. One was even knocked over, probably slipped on the ice or got rammed or something. If you see that movie Italia Brava Gente, right, with the Eastern Front movie, you actually see a working L6 in it, which is definitely one of the L6s that were captured years before. The Soviets kept it operating. But like I said, you won't mind having this for personal use. There's the Semoventi. So, yeah, the light tanks don't do too well, but light tanks don't do well in general in the war. That's one of the lessons learned. And if you have the industrial capacity to go forward and make bigger tanks, well then good for you. Good for you. They didn't have that. Alright, so we'll go over here. Now the Italian armored cars. Now the interesting thing here is now we do the reverse, like the backwards Italians, the poor guys. But guess what, my friend? The first country to use an actual armored car in battle was in 1912. The Fiat Arsenal. Right? Look at this. They had two of these when they were fighting in Libya. So the first country to have armored cars and use them in combat were the Italians. So, and of course, they made a lot of armored cars, right? The Ensemble Lanzia with these crazy, look at this crazy turret. And I like the designs they make on the turret. Of course, then you had with these Fernie Tripolis is the other one. You can see obviously has a different chassis, you know. And you get these things in the front to cut the barbed wire. But look at these crazy turrets. I like how they painted them too. Very. What is that supposed to be? Right, prototype unsuccessful and abandoned. So, but they're trying. Now this is where you start to get this AB40. Now this is actually going to be a relatively decent armored car, right? But you still have something like this. You have basically these trucks they just put the turrets on. These are kind of cool though. The police had these. But once the war in Ethiopia and they pressed these into service, the Italians needed whatever they could. But pretty much, like I said, even in North Africa, you had these World War I armored cars, but you're starting to get like more of these. Okay? Interesting. Had the dual drive, so you had to drive in the front and drive in the back. So instead of having to turn around, let's say you were driving forward and you got ambushed, you could go the other way. Okay, and a lot of times, which was interesting about this armored car, was sometimes it's hard to tell which is the front and which is the back, because an interesting thing, like right here in this photo, right, in combat, or like this computer animation, computer drawing here, in combat, putting the engine in front gave the crew more protection. So they would frequently do that. Like I said, you got to drive the steering wheel in the front, steering wheel in the back. A lot of armored cars did that. And you had this really cramped turret. Okay, and if you notice, this turret is the same turret that you saw on the L6. So they had interchangeable turrets. The British did that a lot. They had the Staghound, which was actually an American made for the British armored car, where they would just change the turrets with they would take them from tanks and like interchange them. So and you still have a lot of these Fiat Tripolis at this point. So, but then again, the British still had, what was the Rolls? They were using the Rolls Royce too. So anyway, regardless, ironically, this seemed to be a pretty decent armored car, but you didn't have a lot of them. Okay, the tanks took more priority, and they realized that these were the reconnaissance, especially in the desert, the distances was very, very important. So you get the and of course the AB43. They made improvements on things. Obviously, they said this armored car had a lot of sharp edges, and the guys would like get cut on them. That's good. Now this is a cool modification. The Sarianas. The chassis of these things essentially stripped of armor, equipped with lots of fuel. This is the Italian trying to counter their famous long-range desert groups that the British had, okay, which is interesting. Obviously, the famous long-range desert group is romanticized, but they had engagements where the Italians actually kicked their asses. Yeah, here you go. This is it, the jerry cans, right? So, I mean, you could go a long way with this. Very interesting. Actually, and obviously a lot even faster. And this is here. This is one of the ones where this must have been after one of the clashes where they whooped the LRDG, and they actually have Vickers guns, just like the Japanese and the Chinese in the Korean War. These guys were grabbing whatever weapons they could. Obviously, there were many armored cars they took from the British. Of course, now this is Tunisia. It's getting near the end. Variations, you get armored transport. It's funny. This looks kind of like a modern armored car, like the ones you see high off the ground to avoid the IEDs. Supposedly this one, the Germans really liked after the surrender. Obviously, the Germans were still producing the Italian stuff for their use and for the loyal Italians who stayed fighting for the RSI. This copy of a Dingo, the Linz. There it is. Apparently these were pretty popular too amongst the troops. And that's pretty much the Italian armored cars right there. Obviously useful fighting partisans in Yugoslavia. And of course the partisans had some of these to capture. But anyway, interesting, really interesting. The armored cars of the Italians. So hard luck, but these guys had guts, man.